Hello everybody, what's up? Good evening. Thank you so much for joining me. You find me tonight in a one-off different location to normal, so there is every chance that the tech could fail, it could all go wrong. This is a temporary setup with bits strung together, extension leads and wires absolutely everywhere, dogs in the room. I mean, it's got huge potential for an epic fail, this one. But let's see how we go. First of all, thank you very much for joining. I appreciate it. We've had all of the F1 testing we're going to get. We've had Drive to Survive drop this weekend. We've got new drivers in new cars, brand new set of regulations and rules, new cars on track as well. And there is so much to go over and talk about. So we've just got a few days till the race. So I just want to go over anything you want to talk about tonight. There's no set agenda. We'll obviously talk about what we saw in testing, anything you've noticed, anything you want to pick up on, any questions you want to ask. Of course, all of that is absolutely fine. So fire them in. But first of all, thank you for joining and hello wherever you are. Big shout out to I think it was MX4211. Apologies if I got your name wrong, but MX4211 listening. There we go, I see you. Hello from Los Angeles, listening to the new Pit Lane Life Lessons podcast whilst waiting for this show to start. Big up to you. Thank you very much. And if you haven't yet checked it out, go and check out my audio podcast. It's called Pit Lane Life Lessons. You can find it in any of the podcast stores. You'll find it all over my socials. But I'd love it if you go and check it out and give me a review in the podcast stores. That would be awesome. Thank you very much. Whilst you're on the subject of plugging stuff, Mike Brewer and I's brand new show, the second season of Wheeler Dealer's Dream Car. I mean, it kind of officially drops next week on the Discovery Channel here in the UK. But if you're lucky enough to either have had it dropped on your Sky Recorder or your Digi-Recorder overnight, or if you've got the Discovery Plus app, you can watch it right now. And it is a great show. Anyone who loves cars will love it. And as I said in my social media post earlier today, if it doesn't put a smile on your face or even bring you to tears of joy, well, you are a cold-hearted, I don't know what. Such a feel-good show. I'd love it if you checked it out, and I'd love to know what you think of it, of course. We've put an awful lot into this second series. I hope you love it as much as we've loved making it. So that's Wheeler Dealer's Dream Car, available now or next week, depending how you're watching. Right, should we get into Formula One? Now that I've plugged pretty much everything I think I've got to plug. Let's have a look at what your questions are. I mean, the first one I've seen lots of people asking already, are Merc sandbagging? And look, I'm going to go straight in and say, no, I don't think they are, no. And a lot of people will say, listen, the same thing happened last year and it's happened in previous years before that, in that they come through testing not looking favourites, maybe looking second, third, even fourth fastest on occasions, and then we get to the first race and bang, there they are, straight up there at the front again. Even though those things have happened in the past, I don't buy it as being sandbagging. I don't believe it's sandbagging. I think sandbagging, in my own experience of being in the pit lane, happens very rarely. It only really happens when you have a car that has even surprised you how good it is. I mean, I'm talking like Brawn in 2009, when you know you've got a car that's so much quicker than everyone else, it's going to start raising serious questions if you show your hand. That's when sandbagging really, I think, is the only real time that comes in. And I don't see anybody this year with such an obvious, massive advantage that they've had to suddenly, you know, fill it up with fuel or peg back on their run plans on what they're going to do. I certainly don't see Mercedes doing that. I see Mercedes having some genuine struggles. Not that they've got a terrible car, but it doesn't look like the fastest car on the grid. They've got some struggles with it, which is not unusual. I mean, come on, we have 6 days of testing pre-season, which, you know, back in my day, that was unheard of. That was 1 week. That was 1 test out of probably 12 before we actually got to a first Grand Prix. 6 days of testing, particularly given the new technology and new changes we've got this year, is a big ask for everybody. Now, I know that most people have survived, most people have done it, and there's very few, relatively speaking, reliability issues, and that's testament to the teams. But when you're at the very front, the likes of Mercedes, they're pushing the limits. They are pushing the limits to extremes, like you would expect, like you'd want them to do. And that does come with some issues, because if your CFD, if your wind tunnel isn't perfectly correlated to the way the car runs on track, and let's face it, it's very easy for that to happen with such a vast sweeping set of changes this year, you will discover problems in testing, and that is exactly what testing is for. So I don't see it as panic stations Mercedes. I see that they don't have a car that's as quick out of the box as some others, like Red Bull, even like Ferrari on many occasions over the course of the tests. But I'm not particularly concerned for them because they have a brilliant set of people. They have all the resources that they could want at their disposal, incredible equipment and facilities, as I say, great people in all the positions throughout that entire organisation. So if anybody can overcome some initial teething troubles, it's going to be them. So let's wait and see when we get to the first race what their genuine performance is, because that is when everybody has to, like they say, drop their trousers and show everyone what they've got in that moment when it comes to qualifying on a Saturday afternoon in Bahrain. That's when we'll see the relative performance of each of those cars. And like I've said many times, it's a dangerous game to play or a foolhardy game to play to judge too critically the performance of any car based solely on what you see from a long way away, let's face it, in pre-season testing. So I don't think they're sandbagging. I do think they've got some issues, some teething troubles, but I think they'll work through them. And whether we see them come back and suddenly be quickest in Bahrain or not, I'm pretty sure they'll have taken a step forward from where they left off at the end of the test this week. What else can we... do you think that Mercedes will come back to Barcelona spec? No, I don't think they will. And look, what you have to remember is the big difference that you saw on the Mercedes between Test 1 in Barcelona and Test 2 in Bahrain, that's not just a set of parts that they were trialling. That's a complete direction change in terms of their development, which has been planned for months. It's not just an experiment. That is their direction plan, their development plan, or their development direction that has been in the pipeline for months now. And that is the direction, the development direction that car is going for the foreseeable future. And of course, if they found it to be absolutely disastrous, yes, they could, in effect, they could wind the clock back and go back to an earlier specification. But the implications of that are huge, both from a development point of view, because whilst we've only seen those parts on the car in the past week, they have been in the pipeline, as I say, for months. Many other parts that follow in that same development path are also in the pipeline and have been for months, are already well through production and into production now. So that's an unstoppable train to some extent. However, the other point is that if they go back, if they wind the clock back to, let's say, the Barcelona spec, apart from there being very limited parts, they also are implicating themselves with a huge amount of wasted cost in a year where costs are absolutely critical to keep control of in a very tight budget spend limit this year. And that would be a very brave move to do. The car would have to be terrible, in my opinion, for them to ditch that entire development path and go back to an earlier specification and change all the consequences and knock-on effects of that, in my opinion. Let's see. Can the bouncing be fixed in the short term? So let's talk porpoising. It's a new word to many people. It's not a new word to me because we've had it before. And in many other categories of racing, you know, it exists. It still exists today when other categories rely very heavily on the underfloor aerodynamics of the car to generate downforce, which Formula One is doing to a greater extent this year. I mean, everybody's talking about ground effects, right? And of course, the effect that happens underneath a Formula One car, to an even greater extent this year, is ground effect. That ground effect is the interaction of airflow in relation to the ground, the floor of the racetrack and the floor of the car. When it's being squeezed close to the ground, it has ground effect. The ground has an impact in that it's being squashed through a narrowing channel underneath the car, and that has the effect of speeding the airflow up because it's going through a tight gap, just like when you squeeze the end of a garden hose pipe. The same amount of water is flowing through the hose, but it's flowing through much faster because you narrow the gap. Now, if you narrow the gap underneath the car, of the racing car, underneath the floor of the car, and then squeeze that against the plane of the racetrack, ground effect says that gap is being squeezed, the airflow is accelerating, and we know that when airflow accelerates, when it increases in speed, it lowers in pressure, and it's that low pressure zone that you're trying to generate under the car that sucks the car down onto the racetrack and generates downforce. It's forcing the car down. And so ground effect is exactly that. However, ground effect has always been in effect in Formula One cars. We've always utilised ground effect. The diffusers utilised ground effects. The high rate cars utilised ground effect. The front wing being in close proximity to the racetrack in all of the previous seasons we've had in recent memory utilises ground effect. So ground effect is not a new phenomenon. It's an idea that I see being written about, being talked about, you know, all of the time at the moment as if it's something new. It isn't something new. It's just we're leaning even more upon it in terms of generating our downforce than we have done in previous years in relation to, let's say, the over-the-top aerodynamics in terms of wings and bodywork and barge boards, those kind of things. So there's a little explainer or a little clarification of exactly what ground effect is. To come back to the question of can the bouncing be rectified in the short term, this bouncing, this porpoising, it's an easy thing to get rid of because you can just raise your car up, raise your ride height, jack the car up so that when it starts to compress under load going down the straight, and if you saw my TikTok or I put it on Instagram stories as well, the car coming down, being squashed at high speed to a point where aerodynamically under the car that gap becomes so small that it stalls, it aerodynamically stalls, and at that point that low pressure zone disappears because that high speed airflow stops flowing. When the low pressure zone disappears, the car pops back up again, and then of course the airflow flows under the car again, the low pressure starts to, or the pressure starts to decrease under the car, and that cycle is repeated. So that porpoising is exactly that. That's what's happening. If you jack your car up, if you just raise your ride height, it'll never compress to a point where the car aerodynamically stalls. Now you might say, well, why on earth aren't they all doing that? Because if you do that, you compromise the overall peak downforce at other parts of the track when you really need it. When you're going through a high-speed turn, you want the car as low as possible because that really low pressure zone under the car, that high-speed airflow, is where you generate maximum downforce. And so they're all reluctant to just jack the car up because it will cost them performance. So what they're trying to do now is either find a balance between a high ride height but minimising the loss of overall downforce and therefore performance, or find other ways to keep air flowing under the car by tweaking elements around the front of the floor or around the leading edge of the Venturi tunnels, for example, around the front of the bib. Lots of work going on in those areas because that can impact the flow structures that pass underneath the car in a very significant way. And you probably saw Mercedes on the very last day of the test, I mean, literally taking a hacksaw to some of the fins on the leading edge of their bib or the front of their floor, just to try and find new ways, almost desperate measures, to minimise this porpoising effect that they were suffering very badly with, because they don't want to have to resort to just raising the car up to overcome the porpoising effect. So yes, it can be fixed, but it means compromising performance, so nobody wants to do that. So there's lots of work going on in every single factory right now looking for alternative ways to change the flow patterns that run underneath the car, to perhaps spin up a vortex that might energise that airflow and just keep it attached underneath the car for longer, for example. Lots of stuff like that being run through CFD programs, being trialled in wind tunnels as we speak in a desperate attempt to try and minimise the porpoising effect. We'll have to see what they will come up with. Right, let's see. What's the last time you've seen Kimi? Do you keep in touch? Do you know, I haven't seen Kimi for ages mostly because during the whole COVID era, I never got to a Grand Prix. And, you know, when you live in different countries, as we do, we only ever really saw each other at races. And because I didn't go to any races in the last 2 years, I haven't seen him for a couple of years now. So, yes, it is a shame. I'm sure at some point we will catch up again. We're not necessarily in touch. We don't speak every week. Haven't spoken to him for a long time, in all honesty, because we haven't seen each other. But I'm sure when we do see each other, it'll be like we just picked up from leaving off yesterday. Right. Nick says, Mark, the shed is much nicer than the basement. Have you been given a raise? I'm not normally doing this from my basement. I don't actually have a basement. I'm doing it from what will be my kitchen and dining room. It's just that the house is under massive renovation, which is why you can see the rafters and all the electrics and everything on display right now, because we're in the middle of a massive renovation. I am now in a little log cabin in our garden, and the only reason I can do it here tonight is because everyone else is out. Normally this is filled with my wife, my kids, my dogs who are still here, and I'm sure at some point will bark and you'll hear them. So this is a temporary appearance from here, and next week I'll be back in the dungeon. Richard Pullman says, Mark, I love the new setup. Thank you, but it won't be here for long. Right, let's see. Will street circuits and rough tracks like COTA break car floors this year, like as in the F1 Endurance Championship? That's John Norris, that one. Well, they could do, is the truth, because yeah, we're going to get a lot more bottoming over the span of the floor. Now, last year and previous years, particularly on the high rate cars, we saw bottoming happening all the time, quite violently with the leading edge of the floor, with the bib, the bit right at the very front underneath where the driver sits. Because the car's tipped up like that, that lower edge, the front edge, is very, very close proximity to the racetrack, and it takes all the hits, and it takes really violent hits. That you often get, you have to have flex in the stay that supports it, because it takes so much of a hit on the racetrack. Now what we're getting is the entire floor being much more level, but overall much lower, and so we're still getting the car and the floor hitting the racetrack over bumps, but now it's across the entire span of the floor. So I don't think we're getting more violence in terms of contact, we're just getting that contact over a much wider area. And that means you are coming into contact with some areas that might be more fragile. So I guess the short answer to your question is yes, we could well see floors being damaged over bumps, the lumps and bumps of a street circuit or a bumpy track like COTA, like you're saying. Lots of you saying I want to see Pharrell and the other doggy. The other doggy is called Wilson, and I won't show you because if I do move the camera, honestly, all hell will break loose here. But check out my Instagram stories because I've just put them both on there just before we went live. Okay, let me see. Hold on. Oh goodness, where's the question? Could a driver endure high-speed porpoising for a full race if a team gets the setup really wrong? Well, that's a good question, and I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I mean, yes, they can. I mean, look, I had a situation, you may remember it, at the Nürburgring, I think it was 2005. Do you remember when Kimi was leading the race and locked up, got a massive flat spot? I mean, a massive flat spot on his front tyre, and that was the year where you weren't allowed to come in and change tyres in a pit stop. And the vibrations that he was suffering as the race went on became more and more violent, eventually, as you know, to the point where it destroyed the suspension and ended our race. But inside the cockpit, the vibrations and the fact that the way that Kimi was being shaken around was so violent that his vision was becoming blurred. But that's around an entire lap. That's not something that's limited to the straights like this porpoising effect is. So yes is the answer. They could manage it for a race. It would be uncomfortable. It wouldn't be particularly pleasant. But I don't think it's going to be something that would necessarily end their race. Only going to happen on the straights. It's not going to happen on every single straight, and it's certainly not going to happen for every single car. So I think it's manageable. It's definitely not ideal. And it's something that teams definitely need to get on top of. And the other effect of this, or the other impact of this, of course, is that, you know, what's happening, as I've just described, is that porpoising is happening because the downforce is building and then disappearing, pulling the car down, popping it back up when it loses downforce. Now, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that if you're relying on that downforce through a long duration, high speed corner, for example, like the long turn 3 at Sochi. I know we're not going there anymore this year, but like the long turn, is it turn 8 at Turkey? Many other tracks that have high speed changes of direction where you're reliant on the downforce to generate all that grip. Well, if the car porpoises, if it bottoms out over bumps, or it has this porpoising effect whilst you're going through some of those, of course you're losing downforce in each one of those moments where the car pops up, and there is a very high possibility that when you lose downforce, you're going to lose grip and you'll spin off into a gravel trap or worse. So yes, it's a definite worry for teams. They need to get on top of it. As you're going round a corner like that at high speed, particularly a long duration corner, you do also have the effect of the car tipping over, and so the porpoising effect will be minimised because of that, because the car tips to a certain extent. I mean, we're not talking much on a Formula 1 car, but it does tip. So you do, you know, one side will bottom out whilst the other side is up, allowing some airflow still to pass through on the inside of the, you know, of the turn. So I don't imagine it's going to be quite as severe as it is going down a long straight when you're going around a corner like that, but a worry nonetheless. Right. William Harris says, Elvis, how well do you think Crofty is going to do at pronouncing Lewis's new surname? And if you haven't seen this, let me just check it, because I need to read it out if you haven't seen this. I just saw this actually in the SeedStream app a moment ago as I was checking for any updates. Where's it gone? It's a long name. It's a difficult name to it's a difficult name to figure out. Where is it? No, I can't find it. Somebody will tell me what it is. Pop it in the chat and I will do my very best to read it out. But yes, Lewis Hamilton is adding his mother's surname to his name. I think it's a really nice touch, to be fair. His mother has a different name and he wants his mother's name to be associated with the Hamilton legacy that will live on long after he has quit, you know, run his days in Formula One. I think that's a really nice touch. What a proud moment for his mother. But it is a name that has, well, let's say it has a lot of letters in it. Has anyone put it in the chat yet? It's a French name. Yeah, anyone got it? No, no one's got it yet. Okay, when it pops up, I'll do my best to read it out. Mike Hughes says it's Labstier. It's something like that. It's not that. It's got more letters in it. There we go. La Bestier or something like that. Everyone's getting it wrong. Labalestier. I don't know. Look, come on, you lot winding me up here. There's about 10 different versions of it. Google it. Right, it is going to be tough to pronounce and tough for people to get used to, but the fact that Lewis has chosen to do that, and for all the reasons that he's chosen to do it, I think is absolutely valiant. And, you know, if that's what he wants to be known as, that is what we should be calling him. So, there we go. Stop sending in a name. It's fine. It's fine. Just Google it. Right, let's move on to questions. Come on, stop it. Right, do you think the Merc will overheat because of its side pods? Right, I'm going to say no, and the reason I'm going to say that is because, you know, they've obviously thought of that, and it's easy to look at that and say, well, it's such a small side pod, can't be as much airflow passing through there, how on earth are they going to cool it? But look, they've obviously thought of that. That's one of the things that will be at the very, very heart of the design process, is making sure they have the maximum cooling available for the worst case scenario in terms of the season. And look, Bahrain in the heat of the day, and they did do running in the heat of the day, would have been one of the worst cases for that, I suppose. So I think, you know, let's say they'll probably be fine on that one. Stop it. Come on, we need questions. You stop writing down Lewis's mum's name. Nick had an interesting question about the pushrod system. Great. Where is it? Let's see. Okay, let's go to this one. John Norris. Do the drivers dislike the new tyres? They don't seem to last any longer and block their view, besides weighing a lot more. I think the fact they weigh a lot more, you know, that's a downside. Obviously, that's a big downside, not just for the drivers, but I think obviously for the engineers, but also just for Formula One in general. These cars have become hugely heavy. I mean, they're nearly 800 kilos, 50 kilos heavier than they were just last year, and they were already massive then. So I know that's not all from the tyres. I was all for, and I am all for, Formula One changing its look. And I like the look of the new cars. I think they look great. I think they are really, they've hit the nail on the head here when they look for a car that's stylised, the sort of car that people will want, kids will want posters on their wall of. I think they've hit that on the head. I think they've got it right. I would love to know what you think. I think the lower profile tyres and the bigger rims, yeah, no, it brings it into this era that it should be in, and I think that's great. Do the drivers like them? I think the drivers are going to be able to push on these tyres for longer, not because they necessarily perform better in terms of outright performance, but because they seem to have a much bigger window of performance before performance starts to deteriorate, which, and of course the thinking behind it is to allow the drivers to push harder for longer to enable part of this whole push to enable closer racing. That's the thinking behind it. Whether they hit it off, I don't know. We'll only find that out really once we start going through race weekends. But I don't think the drivers don't necessarily like them for that reason. Yes, they're bigger. Yes, the bigger wheels and tyres, plus that little fin or winglet over the top of the wheel makes a little bit less visibility. But I don't think that's going to affect people too much. I think it won't be something we're talking about once we've gone through the first race weekend, I would imagine. People looked at the halo and thought, my goodness, how on earth are the drivers going to be able to see anything with that great big bar in front of them? But the reality is, a driver's rarely ever looking forwards. It doesn't really impact them very much, and they just got used to it, and they'll do the same with the tyres, I would think. Chris A says, new race director, new stewarding rules and relevant systems. Please discuss. Okay, let's discuss that. New race director. I mean, you know my feelings on getting rid of Michael Massey. I completely understand why he's gone. I don't think they dealt with it in any way correctly. I don't think they dealt with it in the right way. I think they could have done a much, much better job of dealing with that from a personnel point of view, just within the FIA, and also, and perhaps even more so, from a communications point of view to us, to the wider world, to fans. However, we move on from that. We've got two new race directors. I don't know a huge amount about them. I know at least one of them is hugely experienced. That's got to be a plus. People tell me that he's a no-nonsense kind of guy. And look, there are lots of rules and processes being put in place now that seem very sensible off the back of what happened, not just in Abu Dhabi, but in previous seasons. Trying to eradicate some of the inconsistencies that we've seen. Trying to clarify and simplify some of the decision-making processes. That's all got to be a good thing, hasn't it? I mean, does anybody disagree with any of those changes that have been made to the procedures and the systems that are being used? I think it's all being done for the right reasons, and I think it's all seems like at least sensible processes. Same with anything. There will still be things and decisions that we disagree with, that some fans disagree with, some others don't. That's the nature of sport. When there are humans involved in decision-making processes, you will sometimes agree and sometimes not. And that's part of what we love about sport. It gives us something to argue about, to discuss, to debate on nights like tonight. So we can't get too upset with the fact that we are never going to 100% agree on a decision that's made by any form of refereeing procedure. You can bring in the very best technology and still at some point a human has to make a decision somewhere down the line. Sometimes we'll agree with that decision, sometimes we won't. We want those humans who have to make the decisions to be free to make them without too much outside pressure. We want them to be free to make the decisions without being influenced by players within the sport in those moments. And we want them to have all the resources at their disposal in that moment to be able to make the clearest and best and fairest decision possible when they have to make it in the middle of a Grand Prix. And we want it all done quickly. So all of those changes that are being made are done for those reasons. And for that, you know, I have to take my hat off. I have to say they are doing the right things. Whether they work or not, only time will tell. But they are making decisions for the right reasons, and we should be applauding that. Do you think Marc has the best car this year? I've got no idea who has the best car this year. And despite what... I mean, I've just flicked through some F1 news reports. Every single F1 website is placing the teams in order. They are telling you who's got the best car, who's got the worst car, who's going to effectively win the championship, is almost what they're saying at this point. It's impossible to tell. I don't care what anybody tells you, it's impossible to tell. We've had 6 days of testing. That's it. Many of those pretty, what's the word I'm looking for? Unrepresentative of the opening races of the season. Barcelona was cold. It's a very different circuit that we're not going to be going to in the opening races, and by the time we do go there, completely different temperatures. That was the first test anyway, so most people didn't even have the latest updates on their cars, and they were just trying to figure out what they were doing with this new machinery. Barcelona was an irrelevant test in terms of performance. When we got to Bahrain, For much of the day, we were testing during the daytime, where we won't be doing that in Bahrain. We'll be running at night or in much cooler conditions. So we got very limited amount of running in representative conditions, and even with that, everybody's doing different things at different times. We have no idea what run programs people were going through, what fuel loads they were on. We have no idea what they were working towards, because much as we'd love them to be, they're not all just going out every day trying to get the fastest lap time they can. They are working on all sorts of different systems and run programs throughout that test, trying to answer questions that departments in their factory have set for them to figure out, trying to correlate data that they've collected from inside the factory, you know, all manner of things. And so there's no way to judge, is the truth of this. And look, Red Bull clearly have a pretty quick car. They delivered some quick lap times that others weren't able to match. That's a given. We know that to be true. What we don't know is what anyone else is trying to do. Now, you can safely assume that at some point over that Bahrain test, every team would have wanted to try and put in at least one outright performance run. Now, whether they all got to do that is another story, because reliability and timing all play their part in these things, but they will have all wanted to do that at some point. They wouldn't have all done it at exactly the same moment, in exactly the same conditions, and even with that, they wouldn't have all done it with the same fuel load. So I'm telling you this from the experience of being in the garages, being inside the team when these kind of decisions are made during pre-season testing. As I said to you guys before, we laughed at the people on the outside, the media, trying to second guess what we were doing, trying to judge our car or our performance, trying to put everybody in an order. We laughed at that because we know they have no clue what we were trying to do. And so I now carry that forward. I know that that is what the teams are thinking when they look out and they see every single website putting them all in a championship order almost. It's ridiculous. I know it's a bit of fun. I know we all want to try and have that information to hand. But if you're asking me, that's a very long-winded way of answering the question, you know, who's going to win? Have Marc got the best car? I have no idea. You know, and the cars that we saw leave the test in Bahrain will not be the cars that we see racing in Bahrain a week later. They won't be in the same configuration. They'll have learnt a huge amount more by the time they get back to the race weekend. And so even if they're not physically different, which most I'm sure will be to some extent, they'll be being operated in a different way. So let's just wait and see. Let's try and be patient. I know it's so hard when we're this close and we've already seen cars running, but let's be patient until we get to a race weekend, and then we can start judging the relative performance of different cars on the grid. Right, sorry, that was a rant, wasn't it? Do drivers have to drive more cautiously because of the budget could run out? Because the budget could run out if they crash. Yes, quite frankly, yes, they do. Teams have a budget for crash damage or for repairs. You know, they have to factor that in to their seasonal budget, and they can change it. They can adapt it as the season goes on, because obviously, if you get down to the last 3 races and you've got you haven't spent any of your crash budget or your repair budget, you can start to reallocate those funds to other areas, because you're not going to do a whole season's worth of damage in the last 3 races, hopefully. But the truth is, yes, the teams will be briefing drivers, and particularly ones down the back end that maybe haven't even got the maximum budget available, as they always do at that end of the grid, will be briefing their drivers that they simply can't afford to have a huge amount of crash damage week in, week out. That is a genuine factor in Formula One this year. I mean, it's always been a factor for the teams down the back, but this year it's a factor for everybody. Right, there we go. Oh, here's an interesting question. How much idea did you guys have about your car's performance after testing? 90%? Says Coastal Rookie. That's a good question, right? Because there is a real feeling when the car goes out on the very first day. And I referred earlier to the Brawn GP car of 2009. If you speak to Jensen, and I have, about this, the very first day that car went out, they turned up late to the very first test in 2009 because they were just behind schedule. But when they turned up, the car was unbelievably fast, and everybody in that garage knew they were onto a winner. They had something very special. And so immediately they had to start sandbagging. So sometimes, very rarely, you get this little insight that your car has blistering performance without you having even done anything to it. I mean, that's a very nice feeling. It's a very rare feeling. It's a very nice feeling. Of course, conversely, there are days when you send your car out on the very first day and you get a pretty big insight into how bad it is. And I've been through that as well. The MP4 18, remember that? Probably don't remember it because it was a car that never ever raced. That was the car back in, when was it, 2003? Or it was destined to race in 2003 but never actually made it because it was so bad. Not just in terms of performance, and it was pretty slow, but in terms of reliability, it was even worse than that. It was terrible. It fell apart, it caught fire, and even when we got it to actually run, the performance was disastrous. And look, we knew that after 2 days, 3 days of running. We knew it on the first day, to be honest, but by the second and third day, we'd confirmed that to ourselves that we had an absolute dog of a car on our hands. So to answer your question, Coastal Rookie, at the end of a sort of regular test, yeah, you have a pretty decent handle on the performance of your car, on the characteristics of your car. What you're looking for is, as well as outright performance, you're looking for how well does it respond to changes. Obviously, you're looking for reliability, but how well does it respond to changes? How well does the data that you already have from your factory correlate to the car on the racetrack? How well does all of that data and the data you're collecting when the car's out on track correlate to what the driver's feeling in the car? And when the driver's feeling something, does his feedback lead you down the right sort of path? So when he says, I've got a bit of oversteer through turn 3 and you make a change to the rear anti-roll bar, for example, does it have the effect that you expect it and want it to have? Or is it slightly different? In which case, do you have to create a whole new map of changes in response to different characteristics? So those are all the kinds of things that teams are working on throughout testing. And it's for those reasons that I say, be very careful how you judge performance over the course of a test. Teams will spend a whole day sweeping through setup changes, making changes just for the only reason of finding out what those changes do to the characteristics of the car. Now that's not looking for performance. The driver might be pushing as hard as he can. He might be on the absolute limit, but the car might just be not in the correct setup window because you're having to sweep through a raft of changes to figure out how it responds to those. So it's very difficult to judge, but the answer is yes. You have a very good idea of what your car is capable of in terms of performance, but also a direction that, you know, where its weaknesses are, where its strengths are. And so between the test that's just finished and the race coming up this weekend, parts will be being designed, will even be being manufactured. They can do that for some parts that quickly. And they'll be brought out to the racetrack and you'll see some of them on the cars this weekend. So I say they won't be the same cars that finished the test in Bahrain on Saturday by the time we get to the race in just a few days' time. Right, hold on. How different is testing of a completely new concept F1 car, like in 2014 and this year, compared to on a regular early season testing? Yeah, it's huge, because whilst you go through a similar program when it's just between, let's say, 2020 and 2021, you know that, your engine's the same pretty much, and I know that continues this year, but you know the aerodynamic principles of the car are the same, and the design process, in the most part, will have just been an evolution of what came before. And so you can expect, or you can assume, that most of those things that I've just described, will the car respond in the right way or the way you expect it to changes? Well, that's much more likely to be the case because it's just an evolution of the concept that went before. What we have now is a completely new concept, a completely different way of thinking, aerodynamically, but also mechanically. Let's not forget, whilst we're all looking at the aerodynamics of these cars, because that's the bit you can see, underneath the hoods, inside the chassis, mechanically the suspension is very different as well. Because we've got these very different types of tyres, wheels and tyres, the suspension is also very different to accommodate that. So there's a whole raft of changes on these cars, some of which we can see, and we're all marvelling at the new side pods on the Mercedes, or a new front wing, or new floors, or whatever turn up that we can see, but everything's new. So everything underneath the bodywork that we can't see is also new, and is also probably changing at a similar rate to the aerodynamic components that we can see. So don't forget that that stuff's happening, even though it's not necessarily in the public eye. And so because of that, testing is very, very different. You have to work through almost from a blank canvas of what you know, with a run program of things you need to learn when you have such big changes like you do this year. So yeah, huge. In 2014, just to go back to that, of course, that was the big power unit change, wasn't it? So mechanically and aerodynamically, the cars weren't as different as they are this year, this time around. But then it was much more about engine, of course, and the systems that were on board those cars. The ERS systems was a massive change for everybody, and getting their heads around that, both just how it worked, but also how to tweak it and fine tune it to get the best performance out of it, was a mammoth task. And so a huge amount more energy in that year would of course had to been put into testing those kind of systems. And don't forget, now we've got much more limited amount of testing available to us as well. So the teams have to be really efficient with how they go through their days, and reliability is absolutely key, because if you lose a day or half a day, that's a huge chunk of your overall testing availability that's just gone before the season's even started. All right. Will Haas win races with K-Mag Magic? Will Haas win races? I mean, look, I hate to say no at this point, because for all the reasons I've just said, they showed some performance. I mean, I'm not thinking they're suddenly going to be championship contenders. But if you think about these regulation changes that we've got, the whole point of them is to try and close up the grid. It's to allow cars to be a little bit closer in their overall performance spread up and down the grid, but also to allow them to race more closely. And on top of that, because we've got such sweeping changes in terms of the cars and the regulations, there is prime opportunity, particularly in the early part of the season, for a team like Haas, if they can get it right, if they can nail reliability, for example, to capitalise on the mistakes and failures of others who are still getting to grips with this whole new way of going racing. So I wouldn't say that there's no way that Haas can win a race this year. Let's just reserve judgment on that, because they showed a little bit of pace, a little bit of performance. Who knows whether that's good enough to mix it at the front end. But like with any big change, and often it used to happen just at the start of a season anyway with the new cars, there are opportunities for the smaller teams if they can just be there at the finish, because some of the others may not be there at the finish because of reliability or because they get something wrong in a new way of working. Let's wait and see. Right, prediction time, no excuses. Who wins the Drivers' and Constructors' Championship in 22? Well, after everything I've just said about not making predictions on performance, okay, let's do it. Who's going to be Drivers' and Constructors' Champions in 22? Look, I still find it very hard to bet against Lewis. Sir Lewis Larbastier Hamilton. I think it's very hard to bet against him. That's not based on the performance at the test, clearly, but if you think about that team and how much strength in depth that team has, how much experience he has and the team have of winning and of overcoming problems. Let's not forget, look at the records. They have won the last 8 Constructors' Championships in a row. I mean, if you just look at those stats, you think it's been an absolute walkover, and to some extent it has, but there have been moments in those years where they have had disastrous weekends. They have found massive imperfections or failures with their car and had to dig deep to overcome them. I mean, we've had very clear examples of that, where they've found weaknesses that have caught them out at certain racetracks and have had to go away and really focus on those weaknesses, but yet have then turned them around. I mean, just last year, Lewis found himself, 30 points behind in the championship midway through. And as a team and as a driver, they dug their way out of that and clawed their way all the way back by the time they got to the end. So I would never write Lewis Hamilton or the Mercedes team off. So I'm probably going to go with them. And that might sound like a really boring decision, a boring choice, but it's based on my experience of their experience. Having said that, I think, look, Ferrari seemingly have a good car that seems to deal with many of the problems that others are facing in a better way. I've got question marks over Ferrari's long-term capability, and I mean long-term in terms of over the course of a season, to consistently deliver in every area, from their drivers to their car, to their strategy, to their pit stops. I don't think I've seen enough to say that they can nail every area of their overall operation over a long, significant and consistent period. That's just my opinion. That might be harsh, and I hope they prove me wrong, because I would love to see Ferrari back at the front battling for world titles again. I think that's where they belong. It's an iconic part of this sport, and I really would genuinely love to see them fighting up against them again. So let's hope I've got that wrong. Red Bull, of course, we know what they can do. They have won a championship last year. Cue comments about, did he really win a championship? But look, he was in the fight for a championship all year. The team were in a fight for a championship, and that's testament to the car they built, the way they operated it over a season, the way it was driven, and the way they executed their race strategies and their run plans and everything else. They did a great job, as did Mercedes. So any of those top three teams are obviously in a great position to challenge for world titles based on their experience, their resources, the people that they have, their previous experience of winning races and championships. They're all capable, we know that. And I think you could potentially add McLaren to that bunch as well. We're yet to see what McLaren have really got, because they were so hampered in the test with reliability issues. So there are my predictions. And look, speaking of predictions, there's one thing I forgot to plug at the start. The new SeedStream app, which has had updates, by the way. If you've used it before, give it another go, come back. We've made some major updates ahead of this new season. So I hope you like what you see. Lots of tweaks to the way the whole app operates and the way that it looks and feels. I hope you enjoy that. But more importantly, the Predictions League is open now. And if you follow me on Instagram, you'll have seen I posted a screenshot of my own predictions for this weekend. We've made changes to the way that's scored. So hopefully a bit more or a little bit easier for people to catch up if they fall behind or if they miss a week. It's free to enter. It's just a bit of fun. We all compete amongst ourselves. But pop over to the SeedStream app, seedstream.org. You'll get all the information. You can download the app there. Check it out. So there you go. That is my predictions done. And let's talk about McLaren, because McLaren has brake issues, says somebody there. Not a question, but a statement. And a true statement at that. They have had brake issues. Those brake issues seem to be around cooling, don't they? In that the brakes and the brake ducts and the paraphernalia around those brake ducts were getting so hot. I mean, essentially they were burning. And the problem they have, obviously that's a problem in itself. Brakes overheating is a problem. Bahrain's a heavy braking circuit, so perhaps it's one of the most extreme examples. But even so, the components inside that, the drum and all the shrouds and everything else made out of carbon fibre that's inside there and surrounding that brake disc, were getting so hot, they were burning, they were going crispy, and eventually they were failing. And they were running out of components, and therefore they had to limit their running to minimise that effect, because if they ran out of those brake cooling components, essentially they can't do anything. So what we didn't really see from McLaren is much in the way of long runs, lengthy race distances, certainly at peak performance level. So I don't feel like we've seen the outright performance of that McLaren. We've seen glimpses of something that looks very good and looks very quick. And if they can nail that reliability, there's nothing to say that McLaren cannot be up there mixing it with the other three teams I've just talked about. So I've got high hopes for them this year. I really have. I hope they've nailed it. They're on a trajectory that is, for the last few years now, has been heading in the right direction. They've got some great people running the show now, great people at the helm, some management changes over the course between last season and this season on a race team level. And I know the people that have been put into certain positions, they are good people. They are good changes that will have, I'm sure, in fact, I know, a positive effect on the team themselves. So, look, I think McLaren have been doing very well, have been heading in the right direction, are continuing to improve things to continue that journey. And at some point, whether it's this year or further down the line, we are going to see them heading back to the very top of the pinnacle of Formula One. And that is where, you know, I would love to see them. Right, let's move it on again. Where are we? Right. Where was the question about George Russell? I saw one, sorry. Okay, I've missed it. What health problems? Daniel Ricciardo. Will Daniel Ricciardo be back this weekend? I mean, look, I have no crystal ball into the health situation of Daniel Ricciardo, but he's certainly allowed to be in terms of regulations, having had COVID. Because he's in Bahrain, he is subject to those rules, and he will be clear of any quarantine restrictions that he has to be under by the time the race weekend comes around, as long as he's feeling better and over COVID. People suffer with this illness in different ways. So, yes, from a regulation point of view, he should be free to drive. From a health perspective, I mean, I'm not there. I have absolutely no idea how he's feeling right now. The dog's off for a beer. Yeah, you see the dog walk past. We'll all be off for a beer in a minute. It is 9 minutes to 10. Let's get a few more in. Here's the George Russell question. Thank you, Red Eye, for posting that again. Will George Russell be allowed to push Hamilton and fight for the championship, or will he be forced to play a supporting role like Bottas? Right, let's address that, because I know this to be true in that Mercedes have never set out in the start of a season with Valtteri Bottas, Nico Rosberg. I'm sure they won't do it with George Russell as a supporting role to Lewis Hamilton. That just doesn't happen. The supporting role comes in later in the championship when one of your two drivers have got themselves into a position where they're the ones going for a championship. They're the ones in a championship fight. Now, as it's turned out, more often than not, Lewis Hamilton has been that guy. Valtteri Bottas has had some flashes of brilliance but dropped away, and therefore it's an obvious and natural decision for the team to favour the driver that's in with a shout of the championship as the season draws towards its conclusion. And I have no doubt that will be the same for George Russell. I mean, if you think about when we signed Lewis Hamilton at McLaren back in his very first season, he was a rookie, and alongside him was the current world champion in Fernando Alonso. There was never any such thing as heading into a season with team orders, in that Lewis was going to have to back up Fernando as we went into that season. Of course, we all know what happened in that season. It was disaster. But as we went into that season, and if you read my book, you'll know the answer to this, but the people within that team had it in their mind that Lewis would be there learning his craft, backing up Fernando. Fernando would be the main man and Lewis would be there to pick up the pieces. That's what we thought. No one said it. It was never part of the plan. No one wrote it into a contract. There was nothing like that. But people assumed it because he was the young rookie learning how to deal with Formula One, certainly learning how to deal with McLaren. Now, George Russell, I think people will look at that. This question comes from the fact that people will have something like that assumption in their minds. Lewis is a 7-time world champion. George Russell hasn't even won a Grand Prix yet. And so there will be an assumption that that's what will happen. But there is no way Mercedes will write that into a contract. There's no way they will instruct George Russell not to push Lewis or not to take on Lewis for a race win. He'll be given the same opportunities. He'll be given the same freedoms. And only when it really matters for the championship later on might there be team orders put in place. But to answer your question, yes, he'll absolutely be allowed to push Lewis Hamilton. Okay, here's one. Sandy Barnes. How does pushrod versus pull rod suspension affect performance? So you'll have seen there's a little bit of a mix, or there are some differences, let's put it that way, in terms of who has pushrod suspension and who has pull rod suspension. You can tell it. I mean, I'm sure many of you know this, so sorry if I'm teaching you something you already know, but let's take the front suspension. If you look at the front end of a car, the chassis down the middle, the two wheels out to the side, wishbones, double wishbones, the top wishbone, bottom wishbone. The push rod is the other element that connects the wheels or the uprights to the chassis. Now, a push rod suspension sends load from the bottom of the wheel as it goes over bumps. It pushes that load up a push rod up into the top of the chassis, where it then meets the other suspension components, the rocker, the dampers and torsion bars, that kind of thing. A pull rod works the other way. So if you're looking at the front of a car on a pull rod setup, they point down towards the bottom of the chassis. So top of the wheel outboard, running downwards into the lower part of the chassis. We're still connected to rockers and torsion bars and dampers, but it's done at the lower part of the chassis. Now, there are differences, obviously, in terms of the way those loads are transferred. They do make a difference. One's not better than the other, just through the mechanics of it. It's just a difference. The other differences come from with a pull rod setup. When they're entering the chassis at the lower part of the chassis, much of those components, like the heavy rockers, are much lower down in the chassis. So you get a lower centre of gravity, which is good in terms of you minimise the weight transfer going around corners. That's good for chassis dynamics. But the main reason that teams choose one or the other is to suit their aerodynamic profile of the car. And that might seem like a weird thing because it's just a really slim, aerodynamically shaped component that doesn't seem to take up much in the way of airflow, but it does have a reasonably big impact in where the airflow is disturbed, coming off the front wing, passing through the front suspension, and then critically, how it then moves on towards those areas like the inlets of the side pods for cooling, or the front of the floor now, the leading edge of the Venturis, critical areas. And so by changing which one of those setups you have, what you're really focused on is how you want the airflow to pass through those structures and then head on back down the car. So it's much more of an aerodynamic change than it is in terms of what mechanical differences it makes. That's the biggest focus, and that will be the main reason that anybody has gone with whichever solution they've gone with this year. So it isn't that one is better than the other, it's just that they are different depending on what the overall strategy you've gone for in terms of aerodynamics around your car. Right, probably time for one more. Where are we? Let's find another one. Hold on. Mark, do you get paid to talk drivel? I do. That is, I do, yeah. I do. I've created a career out of it. Thanks very much for that. All right, come on, let's find one more question. Hold on. Right, Drive to Survive. Should we finish up on Drive to Survive? I'm up to, I think, episode 8. I've watched them over the course of this weekend. Look, I watch these things and I've seen so many people from the F1 community this weekend moaning and complaining about how it's not real, it's hammed up, it's dramatised, it's got too much Hollywood sound effects and all the rest of it in there. And I agree with every word of that. But I'm never going to complain about it because this show is not directed to people like me or to people like you. It's not directed towards Formula One experts. I have met so many people. I was in New York even just this week gone. 3 people out there said to me they've become Formula One fans because they saw last season's Drive to Survive on Netflix. Well, they probably wouldn't have seen it on Netflix out there, I don't know, but they saw it last year and it drew them into the world of Formula One. They started watching off the back of it. That is exactly the purpose that this show has. And yes, it's over the top. Yes, some of the rivalries are hammed up and built up to a level that we know they're not in real life. But it's an entertainment show as much as anything else. It's about dragging in a new audience, and that is exactly what it's done. So the producers of that show, the people behind it, the people who commissioned it from an F1 perspective, knew exactly what they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing, and it's working. And so that has to be seen as a success. I watch it because I will watch pretty much anything to do with Formula One, and I think most Formula One fans would do the same. But when you watch it, you have to watch it through the eyes knowing that's what you're going to get. We're not watching a Grand Prix weekend. We're not watching the live coverage of a race weekend here. We're watching a dramatised version of all of those things that happen. So take that into account if you watch it. I would still recommend tuning in if you haven't already. I think it's entertaining. There's still lots of nuggets in there that I didn't know, that I've never seen before. Access that we never get over a race weekend. And I feel that's interesting enough for people like me to still be drawn into it. And it's dramatised enough to bring new fans in and make them think, my goodness, is this what Formula One is like? I want to watch more of it. I think it's a big success. I'd love to know what you think. Probably not now because I've got to go. But tag me on social, let me know, drop me a line anywhere you like on any of my channels. At F1 Elvis is where you'll find me. Check out my podcast, Pit Lane Life Lessons. Appreciate if you do that. And don't forget, because Wheeler Dealers Dream Car, our new show, is now live on Discovery Plus and will be live linear on Discovery Channel next week at 9 p.m. This show will move back to the 10 o'clock slot that we did last time my show was airing on a Monday at 9 p.m. I can hardly ask you to watch that show and come and watch me at the same time. So I apologise if that doesn't suit many of you. I know it does suit some of you more. It's just what we're going to have to do for the next few weeks. 10 p.m. next Monday night, I'll see you back here. Have a great one, folks. See ya.